The scientific process is a way of thinking. It's a cycle. It's a process that's allowed mankind to discover many different things in science. So, for example, you see something strange or odd, you observe that, and then you make a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis by setting up some sort of experiment. You look at your results, see if it matches up to anything, and then you go from there. You might reevaluate your hypothesis, you might change up your experiment, but from there, it always allows you to keep asking questions and keep learning new things. Here's an example of the scientific process. You observe that a candle's flame goes out when it's covered completely. So then you hypothesize that maybe flames or fire needs oxygen to continue burning. So to test your hypothesis, you set up an experiment where you cover the candle, but then you leave a mint plant in there with it, because you know that mint, or plants in general, produce oxygen. You then see results where the candle's flame continues to remain lit even though it's covered. So then you come to a conclusion that perhaps fire needs oxygen to continue burning. Do maggots come from meat, or do they come from flies? This was a serious question that people considered back in the 1600s when you didn't really have food sanitation or health guidelines. So, people used to leave meat out in the open. They noticed that the meat would form maggots. Now, they actually didn't know that the maggots came from the flies. They assumed that it actually came from the meat. So, Francesco Redi designed one of the first controlled experiments. He left the meat inside a container and he covered it, and now he noticed that there were no maggots. But that didn't really prove that the maggots came from the meat or the flies. So he set up a different experiment where he had it covered in gauze, and now this attracted the flies, and he noticed that the maggots didn't come from the meat, but it actually came from the flies itself. A clever experiment illustrating the scientific process. Experiments are an important part of the scientific process. There are things that determine the outcome of the experiment, and these things are known as variables. Variables can be independent or dependent. Independent variables are things that you manipulate. You change them throughout the experiment. It's what you're testing for. Whereas dependent variables are the things that you're going to measure, and they determine the results of your experiment. So let's just take a simple experiment where you are testing the growth of plants. You're asking, does water affect plant growth? So you might set up an experiment where your control variables are the amount of sunlight and the temperature that these plants receive, but the independent variables would be the amount of water that you're giving the plants. So you might give plant A 10 milliliters of water and plant B 5 milliliters of water. Those are the independent variables. And then after a week, you might want to measure its height. The height would be the dependent variable. It's what you're measuring. So these two things can then answer your question, does the amount of water affect plant growth? A theory explains a wide range of observations and experimental results. It's generally accepted as fact until there's more evidence that disputes it. Theories can change based on evidence. Just take atomic theory, for example. Back in ancient Greece, people used to think that all matter in the universe was just made of 4 elements: earth, wind, air, and fire. But then you had Democritus come along, and he proposed the idea of the atom, the smallest indivisible thing that makes up all matter in the universe. But then as time progressed, people had more experiments, and they started to observe more things, and this has now led to our current understanding and model of the atom, and that is, it's comprised of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and you have electrons which orbit the nucleus. Up until about the late 1600s, scientists had no ideas that cells were the basic unit of life. Then came the invention of the microscope, and the microscope has revolutionized the way that we study biology, because now scientists are able to see the extremely small things, and they could study life at a level that they never even knew existed in the first place. Furthermore, with advanced tools and technology like imaging, scientists now have X-rays and MRI, so they can study living things in ways that they never thought possible. They don't have to be invasive and cut up an organism to see what's inside. They can just use X-rays to look at bones, and they can use MRIs to look at tendons and ligaments. Furthermore, if scientists can't make observations based on the tools that they currently have, like microscopes and imaging, they can rely on models to study and make predictions. So for example, they can model heart attacks using computer software. It's also a lot more ethical too. They don't have to induce a heart attack on a lab rat or induce a heart attack on a human being and study it that way. They can just use a model, or they can model a flu outbreak, a pandemic, and they can guide the public to safety based on these models here. So some students might ask, what's the point of learning biology? Why does it matter? Well, biology is good to understand because it provides you a lot of general information about your health and information about yourself and the environment. So for example, you can learn about food allergies, you can learn about the effects of obesity and why it's important to maintain a good, regular, healthy weight. You can also learn about cancer or the effects of tobacco and alcohol. There's just a lot of general things in biology that can help you later down the road. Furthermore, knowledge of biology can help you understand issues with the environment. Earth only has a finite amount of resources, and we have to work together to solve and tackle these issues and problems. We have to consider what to do with nuclear waste, overfishing, air pollution, ocean pollution, global warming. So I hope that knowledge of biology can help you make more informed decisions moving forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Win Biology.